Welcome to the Newtown Big Dreams podcast, an interview-style talk show that's your gateway to the fabulous and fascinating people who relocated to start a new life. Whether you're new to our podcast or your city, our fellow neighbors from across Canada, North America, and the entire English-speaking world share their stories of reaching new horizons and big dreams. So sit back and relax as we navigate in-depth and intimate conversations with entrepreneurs, thought leaders, executives, creatives, and anyone who can share their story about their Newtown big dreams. And now, here's your host, Luke J. Menkes.
It's not every day here on The Big Impact that we cross the border and bring on a guest. We can say now that we're internationally connected because our guest today is in the western side of Canada. Luke Menkes is his name. And his program is called Newtown Big Dreams. And I am looking forward to exploring all of the layers of that. Luke, how are you today?
I'm doing great.
You and I are, of course, sharing this conversation for many people in podcast form, but if they could see us in video form, they would see behind you a beautiful backdrop because you are in just one of the more gorgeous parts of the world in that western side of Canada, correct? Give us a feel for where you are and what it's like there.
So this city called Kelowna is it's got about 150,000 people between the city itself and the suburbs. Big industry here is agriculture. So we have a big wine industry, also fruit. So pears, apples, that sort of thing. And tourism is also quite huge. So people that live in Vancouver, Seattle, the Western United States come up here. As you can see from the picture, it's really beautiful.
Yeah.
Our downtown is great. It's got lots of restaurants and great stuff to do.
And for those of you who are listening to us in podcast form, you'll just have to take our word for it.
Yeah,
it is beautiful. Right. Well, Luke, dive in with us to the concept of Newtown Big Dreams. What is it all about?
Sure. So I started a podcast called I Love Kelowna in 2018. Because it's true. And what I did was interviewed local people. And I noticed after about 50 or 60 interviews that 95% of the people that came on the show had moved here from somewhere else. So I was thinking about how do I expand this show beyond Kelowna? Because it's a beautiful, great city, but might not be relevant to someone in Miami or in Detroit or in England. And we were having so many great conversations, but it was centered around Kelowna. So I started every episode with, hey, Bob, you came to Kelowna in 2010. Tell us the story of how you got here. And everybody had a really unique story. People were coming to start a new life in business, or they got transferred with their job, or they met somebody online and fell in love with them and wanted to come here. Or they lived in Vancouver, had made a bunch of money, and were tired of the traffic jams. So everybody had a story, and they had moved here from somewhere else. Now, I have lived in 4 different countries, and I realized that was one thing I had in common with my guests, that I had moved several times to start a brand new life in a new city. So I thought that's kind of interesting. What's it like to move to a new city, not knowing anybody, not knowing about business or social life or anything like that, being kind of an introverted person, and, the homesickness and all those things that entrepreneurs have to deal with when they move to a new city, combined with the excitement of moving to a new city. And I've mostly had a good time doing that, but a few times, it was a little bit awkward. I didn't know anybody, but Kelowna was a great success for me. And most of the people I interviewed said the same thing. So there's people all over the world, that I took a podcast course with a guy named Brian Rose, who has a show called London Real. And he's an American from New York, and he moved to London, England. So he's got that story, fitting in with the culture and making friends and networking and everything. So to me, it just seemed like something unique. There's not a lot of shows about that, specifically about people moving to a new city, making a brand new life.
Well, and when you start thinking about relocating and changing all of, not just your address, but all of the way that you live, the way that you get around, who comes with you and how they all settle in, those conversations can head off in a million different directions. As part of it that jumps to the forefront of my mind is what it's like reestablishing roots and making new connections in a new community. We've lived in the home where my family and I live now just for like 9 years. We only moved 45 minutes from where we used to be, but it might as well have been 45 hours in many cases.
Right.
There's just a whole new set of people and a whole new, surroundings are all new. And it does take a while before you start to feel comfortable, whether it's geographically, like which way is the store, which way is north, or whether it's relationally. And so as you start to explore more of those stories, what are some of the keys for people who are looking for ways to kind of adjust to something new?
Mm-hmm. So most of the people that come on the show are entrepreneurs of some kind. And I find that the principles of starting a new life in a new city are pretty similar to the principles you need to follow for starting a new business. One of the things that, I had a hard time growing up with scheduling and sticking to a routine. I got fired from a lot of jobs because I just didn't like the rigid structure, right? I love being an entrepreneur. As they say, you get to decide how you're going to spend the 18 hours of work every day when you're an entrepreneur. So what I found was I have to have goals and I have to, make a little bit of progress every single day. So that's really how I started. When I moved here, everybody said, well, Kelowna, it's a small city. It was like half the size when I came here 11 years ago. They said, everybody knows everybody. Everybody's been there for 30, 40 years. And it's really hard to break into social circles. So I decided that there must be at least 100 people out of the 80,000 people that are just like me, that are being told it's really hard to make friends. You're not going to meet anybody. It's going to be really tough. It's got to be at least 100 people statistically. So I started a meetup.com group, and it was for newcomers to the city. And sure enough, I had hundreds of people sign up. So from Vancouver, from Eastern Canada, from the Prairie provinces. And everybody said, yeah, I just moved here and it's really hard to meet people.
So instead of thinking you were the only one, you realized, I can't possibly be the only one in this uncomfortable position.
Totally. And even a tiny fraction of the people still made up dozens of people. Right. So I just tried to look at it mathematically and say, look, even if it's 1/10 of 1%, I just got to find those people.
Yeah. So did it work?
And then, it worked. So, I became a realtor. I was licensed before. I lived in Florida. I grew up in Toronto, so I was a realtor in those places. And again, people said, you're going to have a really tough time because the realtors here have been established. And so what I did was I positioned myself as the relocation expert. So the people that moved here and they needed to buy houses and they were encouraging their friends and their family to move here because it's such a great place. And they said, you should talk to Luke because he's a great guy. So, we were all kind of starting at the same level. They didn't know anybody. They didn't know these realtors that have been here 30, 40 years. And I could relate to them. So I could connect them with people, and help them break into that kind of tight-knit social environment. Now it's really changed. It's much more cosmopolitan. It's still a mid-sized city, but a lot more people now, as I found with my podcast. I'm just running into all kinds of people that came from somewhere else now. So whatever they told me 11 years ago is totally not true today.
Well, when you think about entering a new community and you don't know anybody, it can be a daunting idea to just put your trust in somebody. Whenever you're looking for information or a resource or some guidance or repairs or whatever it is, when you're new somewhere, I can't tell you how many times I've turned to a neighbor and said, hey, who does this in town? And most often they will have a reliable name that they can recommend. So if it weren't for that word of mouth kind of an approach, people would stay isolated and probably not have any way of establishing themselves in a new community.
Definitely. Yep.
So in your part of the world, what's next as you work in real estate, you work in helping people relocate? They're in your town. That makes perfect sense. What are some of the principles, though, that can apply to people in other regions?
Well, I guess the first thing, and same with starting a business, you have to decide why you're doing it. What's the reason? Now, if you're running away from something, if you had a bad situation in a previous city, they say your problems tend to come with you. So on the one hand, it's good to start from scratch. On the other hand, you have to really understand why you're doing it. So if you had a hard time getting along with people in Detroit, you're probably going to have a hard time getting along with people in Kalamazoo, right? So, or if it's, you had a bad relationship or something like that. But if it's for a positive reason, because in my case, it was my daughter who was 6 years old at the time. And her mom wanted to move here. We were separated, but she wanted to move here because for work reasons. And I looked into it and I said, fine. So we were raising her together, but separate. And so I agreed to do it. So that was my reason. And because I'd moved, 4 or 5 times before in a major way, I knew I could do it. I knew I could. And so like I was saying, you have to kind of set a goal. So what I wanted to do was find a business, find a way to make money, and find a way to integrate into the society, into the community. So I had set goals and just do a little bit every week. So I was quite introverted. I didn't want to go to all these events. So what I would do is I would plan 3-4 events per week and I would stick to it. Even if I didn't feel like going, I would force myself to do it. I would psych myself up. I would shave. I'd put on some nice clothes and I would just do it. And what I found was over time, it just became easier and easier. And then I would start to recognize people and people would say, hey, Luke, good to see you. And that feels good, right? So just setting goals and then sticking to a routine as much as you can handle. I wasn't the type of person that was going to go out 4 or 5 times a week, but I could handle 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, and you also you took an important step, which was to force yourself outside of a comfort zone. And we are creatures, of course, of comfort. That's why it's called comfort. And and breaking free from that can be a little bit intimidating at times. I've often said that everybody's willing to help somebody when it already fits in with their schedule. But what about those times when it doesn't? What are you willing to do that would be considered an inconvenience? Because that's when we really kind of discover what we're willing to do, how far we'll be willing to go, whether it's for our own benefit or to help somebody else. So what'd you discover about that process of getting uncomfortable?
Well, it's sort of like anything that you do that is uncomfortable at the outset, but you feel better afterwards. So like exercising. I used to do a lot more yoga, for example. And every time I would do it, I would say, I wonder why I didn't do this for the last 2 months, because I'd feel so great afterwards. And I found the same with socializing. I also did some volunteer work. And a lot of times, when I was down in the dumps and I would say, well, my problems are too big. How can I possibly help someone else? But when I went to the homeless shelter on Christmas, for example, and just handed out food, and I actually saw some people that I recognized there. And they were embarrassed. They said, oh, I saw you at a pub last time. It was embarrassing. And something happens in the brain when you volunteer, just your problems just shrink. Like they magically shrink. And you also get a sense of whatever you're facing, you can deal with it. And so it's not like you're logically saying my problems are less than theirs are, but it just feels good. It feels really good. You feel like, humanity is good and my problems aren't so big anymore.
Yeah.
I would always feel better once I did it.
I'm glad you said that. I have the chance to do quite a bit of work with homeless shelters throughout the Midwest, to serve as a consultant for several of them in their messaging and their communications and their fundraising. And quite often, what is required of that partnership is I will interview the people who they are helping. Usually it's those who are nearing a point of graduation from a recovery program, or perhaps just got their own place and they couldn't be more excited to just put a key in the lock somewhere, as opposed to going to sleep in the dorm in bed 14. It's a big difference that we, with people with studios and microphones, that we just take for granted, because it's a world that's completely separate from what most people would know. I saw a comment on a social media site for one of the rescue missions I work with last week. Somebody commented, "I just can't figure out why anybody would ever be homeless," and it jarred me. It just the naivete of the question jarred me. And I instantly thought, that's because you've never taken the time to go and visit, to go and volunteer, to go and just say hello to somebody who's staying there. You'll rapidly discover these are real people. They just made some decisions that they should have made in a different direction. For the most part, these are folks. I can remember the first time I visited the rescue mission where I eventually would begin working as the development director. Sat in a lunchroom at a table surrounded by men who were in the long-term recovery program. And I didn't know any of these guys. I just started kind of doing what I do, which is interview people. Just started talking to them. And I discovered that here was a General Motors engineer. Here was a former professional football trainer. Here was a school teacher. Here, these are intelligent, accomplished, educated people who made bad decisions. And part of the reality of talking with them brought about back to me this reminder. One, I'm a handful of really bad decisions, perhaps from needing that sort of help. And two, how dare we turn our noses up at those who need that sort of help? And so I'm glad to hear that you were able to experience that firsthand and go and volunteer. And I've said for years that when people volunteer, the volunteer usually gets more out of it than the organization does, even though they greatly appreciate the help. It's a life-changing kind of experience when you go and give of your time and your talent, isn't it?
100%. Yeah. Bill, at the time when I first tried to volunteer, I was facing a real financial crisis. Like, I was pretty close to being homeless. I never was homeless, but I was routinely late, very late on my rent, sometimes 2 months behind. I always managed to catch up just in time, but many times I slept in my car for the reason that I had to be somewhere and I didn't want to spend $70 for a motel, because I needed the $70 more than a bed. So I slept in my car many times. So it's not the same as, sleeping on the street or in a dorm night after night, but I had that fear that it was about to happen. And it was a friend of mine who said, one of the best ways you can deal with this stress is go help somebody.
Yeah.
And I thought that didn't make sense when I first heard it. I thought, I am so stressed. Like, how can I possibly be present with someone? And like I said, what happened was I just felt much more encouraged, much more alive, less pessimistic. And I found when you change your mindset, you can change your life, right? And like I said, I just felt so much better doing that. And I was amazed to find out that even when times are tough, when you help someone else, you're going to feel better. So,
Very true. And it also helps us take a focus off of me, and shift our attention to somebody else. It's been said many times by people who have studied it much more deeply than I have, that in America, for instance, and in Canada, for instance, the definition of being in poverty is vastly different than the rest of the world would describe poverty.
right.
For the most part, I know that there are exceptions to this, but for the most part, the poorest of the poor in America generally have access to food. They generally, if they want it, they generally have access to shelter, whether it's at a mission or perhaps through some assistance. In many cases, you'll see folks at a homeless shelter who have cell phones, right?
Yeah.
So we shift that focus. We go to the other side of the world, and you watch Slumdog Millionaire, for instance, and you realize what poverty looks like in the truest definition of it all. So as we feel these stresses, as we feel these pressures ourselves to keep up with the neighbors, to get the latest, to get the greatest, to get the version 2.0, because I've only got the 1.0, and who could ever survive with the 1.0? We realize that we often put pressure on ourselves that it doesn't belong there. It does us no good to have it there. And as you continue to explore these stories on Newtown Big Dreams, it would be interesting to learn what sort of pressures newcomers in your area are putting on themselves that really they're just kind of borrowing trouble to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I've heard so many great stories. It's really interesting. One person who is quite prominent in our community, but he was, a straight-laced kind of guy, and 9 to 5, working towards the pension, work for the same company for decades type of mentality. And someone told him to come here because there was an opportunity. And so it was like a huge decision and, a really big deal for him and his wife. And he came here within 2 months of coming here. The company had to file for bankruptcy. And he couldn't go back to his previous job because he was replaced. And he was so stressed out. He was like, how am I going to pay the mortgage? How am I going to, but he found his inner entrepreneur and put some things together. And he was like, well, I'm kind of good at this and I'm kind of good at that. And he ended up pairing tech companies with investors because he decided, well, he was actually quite good at making introductions, but it was a skill he didn't realize he had. So he had to kind of look within himself. And he said, in hindsight, it's kind of ridiculous. Like he said, what you said, compared to 90% of the world, those kind of problems aren't real problems. But for him and the way he was raised and what he was used to was a tremendous amount of stress. And it was putting strain on his marriage. And, he just didn't know what to do. I think, as adults, especially with children, not knowing what to do kind of takes a hit on our self-esteem.
Yeah, for sure.
We're supposed to know how to pay the rent, right? We're supposed to know how to pay our cell phone bill. And when we're at a loss, our self-esteem takes a hit. So,
yeah, very true. Especially if you're, a provider, if you're the husband, the father, if you're the one who people look to say, you got to keep the lights on, the food in the fridge, and make sure that everybody is well cared for, then that is a degree of pressure that is quite strong. And in fact, during all of this pandemic mess, sadly, we have seen a lot more depression. We've seen suicide. We've seen those things kind of on the rise. And it makes me sad for a number of reasons, one of which is this is maybe the best time in modern history to be an entrepreneur, to be someone who has an idea and then you're good at whatever it is you do and starting your own business and hanging out your own shingle and making your own way through it all. I know that sounds easier to say than it is to do, But in my world, 25-ish years ago, that's what I started doing. I discovered that I wasn't a great employee. I didn't lose any jobs. I just really didn't enjoy them because I kept thinking, the management here doesn't have any idea what they're doing. That may not have been an accurate assessment on my part, but that's what was going through my probably more arrogant mind. And then I became the business owner and I started to realize it not always as easy as it looks. And at the same time, there is this almost unlimited field of opportunity for anybody listening to our conversation where, you've got all the pressure, you're feeling it, that you've got to provide, you've got to bring in an income, and perhaps because of COVID, your job went away. So whatever that job was, and it wasn't your fault that it went away, that's just what happened. So what next? Well, you can curl up in a ball, or you can really get ready to get after it and to package your skills in a way that would be appealing to those around you. And Luke, whether it's real estate like you're doing, and if it was just pure real estate sales, you might have been somewhat limited, but you began to explore this idea of helping people do what you did, resettle into a new area, and started to find a niche that you could, a need that you could fill. I think that's what the great opportunity is right now for people who are really struggling. And that is, how can I take the skill set that I have? Maybe I need to get a little bit better at it, but maybe I'm really good at it already. And how can I make more people aware of it through some sort of a communication campaign?
Definitely. One of the things I did too was I decided I'm just going to work really hard, not to the point where, I'm going to cause bodily injury to myself. But if you're enjoying yourself at least a little bit, it's okay to work hard. So when times were tough, like I was delivering things, pizza, animals. So our local bus company, for whatever reason, about a decade ago said, we're not taking your cats and dogs anymore. So just through a practice of gratitude. So I was listening to a podcast and he said, when you feel gratitude within yourself, within your body, within your brain chemistry actually changes and you can actually see opportunities that you couldn't see before. So I was like, well, that's a nice concept, but what have I got to be grateful for? I got so many problems, right? They're about to repossess my car, needs new tires, they're bald. And I thought, well, let me just try it. So I said, you know what? The car still works and I'm able to deliver pizzas with this car. So I'm going to feel grateful for just 5-10 minutes. And then on social media, I saw this news article saying pets are now banned on the bus line. And a light bulb went off. And I really believe if I didn't just take 10 minutes a day to feel grateful about my car, which was the only asset I had, I would have missed that article because why do I care? I didn't have any pets at the time. So why would I care? But because I was feeling grateful about my car, I saw an opportunity and I posted an ad that I'll transport your pet, and the phone blew up. I just started getting all kinds of calls from people saying, geez, I got to get my dog here, and I just had surgery and I can't drive and dog's in Vancouver, right? Can you pick it up? And so I started to do that and listening to educational stuff while I'm driving, right? You can focus on you can focus on one thing at a time, but you can do multiple things.
Right.
So listening to something that's educational, I was learning real estate. I was listening to audio about getting my real estate license, which made the exam much easier. I was stuck in the car all the time. So I was able to do, 10, 12-hour days and have a nice time. I didn't feel, I wasn't digging a ditch on the side of the freeway. I was having a nice time, spending time with animals, meeting customers, making a little bit of money and learning real estate at the same time. So.
Well, how often does Newtown Big Dreams come out?
So I got into a bit of a rut at the start of COVID, and I am still publishing episodes from 2019. interviews that I kind of just stopped for about 10 months. I've got about 28 episodes left from 2019. So I've had to call all these people and get permission to, most of them are still quite relevant. Some of them said, well, I moved on from that, but that's still a good story. So I've been doing an episode a day until I catch up. And for the last 4 or 5 months, it's been quite consistent.
That's a lot of content, my friend.
Yeah. I just published number 155 this morning. So
good for you. Well, I appreciate you letting us kind of take a peek inside the world there of Newtown Big Dreams. You can find it everywhere podcasts are found, I would imagine. Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, all the places. And these days you just say all the places. It's like book sales, right? And everybody knows where they can go get books these days. So appreciate the insight, Luke. Thanks much. And we'll hope that everything keeps going well for you.
Thanks so much, Bill.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Newtown Big Dreams podcast with your host, Luke Menkes, and his authentic guests. And we love our listeners and hope you subscribe now to learn more about the amazing journeys of our incredible guests who relocated to find a new town, big dreams. And remember, make your dreams big.